The biting December wind howled through the streets of San Francisco, piercing Jack Miller's thin coat as if it weren't even there. At 73, Jack had lived on these streets for the past 5 years, ever since his wife Linda's cancer treatment bills had stripped away everything they had. Jack curled up in his usual spot near the Tesla headquarters, his frail hands gripping a worn cardboard sign that read, "Veteran, please help." On most days, the smartly dressed tech workers rushed by, eyes glued to their phones. Jack didn't blame them. He had long learned that invisibility was part of being homeless. He had stopped expecting help from others long ago. That morning started like any other. Jack had just finished arranging his few belongings in his cart, the thin blanket he had wrapped around him now bunched up in the back, a few cans and worn shoes scattered around his feet. The streets of San Francisco were already bustling with early commuters, and the cold air bit at his skin as he adjusted the layers of clothing he had carefully layered on. There was nothing new to expect today. It was a routine he had grown accustomed to over the years: get by, survive, and wait for the next day to start. But as Jack began to settle back into his corner, hoping for a few hours of peace before the tech workers hurried by, he heard a loud noise from nearby. The sound of an engine sputtering, and then a sharp screech caught his attention. Looking up, Jack saw a sleek black car skidding to a stop just a few feet away. Smoke began to billow from beneath the hood, thick and heavy, filling the air with the sharp scent of burning rubber and overheated metal. Jack squinted, noticing the driver step out with an air of visible frustration. The man paced around the car, his broad shoulders tensing with each step, the sound of his shoes hitting the pavement adding to the tension in the air. Jack watched curiously, sensing something was off, and then it hit him. Despite his own hardships, despite the weight of his own struggles, he recognized the man. It was Henry Cavill, the well-known actor, a face he'd seen countless times on the big screen. There was no mistaking him. Jack's heart skipped a beat, the familiar feeling of disbelief settling in. "Not today of all days," Henry muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. His handsome face, usually so composed on screen, was now flushed with irritation as he checked his phone, only to realize there was no signal. Jack watched him closely. His eyes narrowed as the actor tried to restart the car in vain, each attempt futile. Jack felt a strange pull. He could relate to frustration. He'd felt it himself, day in and day out, scraping by on what little he had, dealing with obstacles that seemed endless. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone struggle in a moment like this, but seeing someone like Henry Cavill, someone from the world of wealth and fame, going through something so ordinary, so human, was a reminder that no one was immune to life's unpredictability. Despite the weight of his own existence, Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. There was something disarming about seeing someone with so much success brought low by something as mundane as a broken-down car. The truth of it: everyone, no matter how rich or famous, had their moments of helplessness. Slowly, Jack stood up, his joints creaking and protesting the movement. The years of living rough had taken a toll on his body, but he ignored the discomfort. His eyes were still fixed on Henry, whose frustration was mounting. Jack shuffled closer, each step slow and deliberate, his worn shoes scraping the pavement. As he approached, he could see the beads of sweat forming on Henry's brow, the anxiety and helplessness now clear on his face. Jack knew this feeling. He had been there many times before, stranded, alone, with no one to rely on. "Hey, you need some help?" Jack called out, his voice rough from the years of disuse. Henry looked up, startled at first, his eyes scanning Jack before they softened, recognizing the genuine offer in his voice. At first there was hesitation. Jack could see it. Henry's gaze shifted from the car to the homeless man standing before him. Jack didn't look like the kind of person anyone would trust for help, but there was something in his expression, something steady in the way he stood despite his own brokenness. Henry wiped his face with his sleeve, his frustration giving way to exhaustion. "Yeah, I could use a hand," he admitted, his tone a bit defeated. Jack nodded, stepping forward. He wasn't a mechanic, but he had spent enough time around cars in his younger days to know a few tricks. He leaned down, inspecting the engine with practiced eyes. "Might be just a radiator issue," Jack said, his voice calm and surprisingly sure. "Could be clogged, needs a little time to cool down." Henry stared at him for a moment, then glanced at the car with a frown. "You sure?" Jack gave a small, knowing smile. "Well, it's worth a try." He moved around the car with careful precision, suggesting a few methods to check the radiator, even going so far as to show Henry how to open it without causing more damage. It wasn't much, but it was something. The actor followed Jack's instructions, carefully opening the radiator cap and watching as steam hissed out. Jack patted the car, his hands rough but steady. "See? Just a little patience." The two men stood in silence for a moment, a strange bond forming between them, a bond born not of wealth or fame but of shared experience. It wasn't about the car. It was about the connection, the understanding between two people from very different worlds, yet strangely the same. Henry let out a deep breath, wiping his brow once more. "I don't know what to say. I never thought I'd be taking advice from someone like you." Jack shrugged, his face unreadable. "Doesn't matter where you come from, just how you handle it when things break down." Henry looked at him for a long moment, his eyes softening with appreciation. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. "Here," he said, pressing it into Jack's hand. "I can't repay you for this, but I hope this helps." Jack looked at the money, his heart heavy with the gesture. He wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him wanted to refuse, but another part of him, one that had long ago given up on the kindness of strangers, simply nodded. "Thanks," Jack said quietly, "but sometimes the help, it's just enough to know someone's been there, you know?" With a final nod, Henry climbed back into his car, which was now running smoothly, and drove off into the city, disappearing from sight. Jack stood there for a while, staring at the place where the actor had been, the cold wind once again tugging at him. But this time, it didn't feel quite so biting. It was as though, in the midst of the harshness of his world, Jack had found a fleeting moment of recognition. "Excuse me, sir," Jack said gently, his voice rough but calm, as he shuffled closer to the stranded car. "Seems like you're having some trouble with your car. I used to be a mechanic in the army. Maybe I could take a look for you." Henry looked up, startled. His eyes scanned Jack for a moment, taking in the ragged coat, the worn shoes, and the tired face. For a brief second, there was a familiar hesitation, an instinctive wariness that people often had when approached by someone who appeared homeless. Jack had seen it countless times, the cautious glance, the half-step back, the unspoken judgment. But then, something in Jack's demeanor seemed to shift that uncertainty. It wasn't just the offer to help. It was the steadiness in his voice, the lack of desperation. Jack wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't looking for sympathy. There was an unspoken honesty in his gesture, and it was enough to ease Henry in his hesitation. "That would be really helpful," Henry said, his voice tinged with relief. He glanced at his watch, his brow furrowing as he added, "I've got an important meeting, and my phone has no signal here. I can't afford to be late." Jack nodded, understanding the pressure in Henry's voice. He'd seen people with much less worry over their schedules, and yet he knew that, in those moments, everyone's time mattered. Carefully, Jack moved his cart to the side, the old wheels creaking in protest. With a grunt, he straightened, his body stiff and sore from years of surviving on the streets. But his focus was sharp, his mind already slipping back into the rhythms of his former life. He stepped toward the car and peered under the hood, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The familiar smell of oil and grease filled his senses, an earthy, industrial scent that carried memories of his younger days. He remembered the hum of engines, the sound of tools clinking against metal, the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem and fixing it. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he examined the engine. The arthritis in his fingers had grown worse over the years, and the cold wind wasn't helping, but the muscle memory was still there. It was as if his body had never truly forgotten how to work an engine. His mind went back to the days in Vietnam, where he'd spent hours working on military vehicles, keeping them running through harsh conditions. The noise of gunfire, the heat, the weight of the world on his shoulders, all of that seemed far away now, replaced by the simplicity of this moment. A broken car, a chance to offer something, however small. Jack's hands moved with quiet precision, lifting the hood and checking the radiator, then the spark plugs, testing the wires. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful. He could feel Henry's gaze on him, but didn't mind. Jack wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just doing what he knew how to do. His mind, for the first time in a long while, wasn't focused on the gnawing hunger or the bitter cold. It was focused on the engine, on the problem in front of him. After a few moments, Jack straightened, brushing his hands off on his jacket. "It's the radiator," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "It's clogged. You've probably been driving with it running low on coolant for a while. That'll cause it to overheat." Henry exhaled, clearly relieved, but there was a hint of embarrassment in his eyes. "I didn't even think to check it. I've been so preoccupied with work lately." Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "It happens to the best of us. Work takes up a lot of headspace." He motioned for Henry to pop the hood further so he could inspect it more thoroughly. "Luckily, it's not a big fix. Just needs some time to cool off, and then we can flush it out." As Jack worked, he couldn't help but notice the differences between his own life and Henry's. The actor had an expensive suit on, a leather briefcase by the passenger seat, and a look of stress that Jack could almost taste. It wasn't a judgment, just an observation. Jack had learned long ago that everyone carried their burdens, whether they wore them on their sleeves or hid them beneath their smiles. He cleared his throat and continued his work. "I used to do this kind of thing every day, back when I was in the army, fixing cars, keeping the trucks running. It was the closest thing I had to a purpose after all that happened." Henry didn't say anything at first, but Jack could feel the shift in the air. There was something in the way Henry listened to him, something that told Jack his words were being heard, not just dismissed. "I didn't know you were in the army," Henry said after a moment. His voice was quieter now, less hurried, as if the broken car had somehow opened a door to something more human between them. "Yeah," Jack said with a shrug. "Long time ago. I was a mechanic. Fixed cars, trucks, anything that needed fixing. But things change. Life doesn't always go the way you plan." Henry nodded slowly, glancing at the engine before meeting Jack's eyes. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Jack paused, considering the offer of sympathy. He wasn't sure if he wanted it, or if he even needed it. What he needed now was to help Henry, to keep his focus on something he understood. "Life's tough for everyone," Jack replied. "But at least you've got a car that can be fixed." For a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. Henry with all his fame and fortune, and Jack with nothing but the remnants of a past long gone, had found something they shared, a common ground, however brief. Jack finished up the work, making sure the car would run well enough for Henry to get where he needed to go. As he wiped his hands on his coat, he stood up and turned to Henry, who was staring at him with something akin to gratitude in his eyes. "I think that should do it," Jack said with a final nod. "Just take it easy for a while. Don't push it too hard." Henry smiled, a mixture of relief and admiration crossing his face. "I don't know what to say. You've saved me. I'd be stuck here without you." Jack gave a small, modest shrug. "You don't have to say anything. Just take care of that car, all right? It'll take care of you if you treat it right." Henry reached into his wallet, pulling out a few bills, but Jack quickly raised a hand. "Don't need it," he said with a smile. "Just glad I could help." For a long moment, they stood there, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Henry finally nodded, closing the hood of the car and getting into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, the car hummed to life, smooth and steady. "Thanks again, Jack," Henry said, his voice sincere. Jack tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Take care, Henry, and good luck with that meeting." With one final glance, Henry drove off, leaving Jack standing by the curb. As the engine faded into the distance, Jack turned back to his cart, the wind still biting at his skin, but somehow just a little less cold. "You've got a coolant leak," Jack explained, his voice steady as he pointed to a small crack in the radiator hose. "I can patch it up enough for you to make it to your meeting. It won't last forever, but it'll do for now." Henry leaned in, squinting at the problem as Jack spoke. He nodded, his brow furrowing in concern. "I didn't even notice that. I guess I've been too distracted with everything else." Jack didn't respond immediately. His focus was already on the task at hand, his eyes scanning his cart for the tools he needed. He'd learned over the years to make do with what he had, and in this moment he knew he could fix what seemed like an impossible situation. He reached into the cart and pulled out a few items: a small bottle of drinking water, a piece of rubber that he'd kept for emergencies, and a few basic tools. It wasn't a full set of professional gear, but it was enough. "I'm not going to be able to get it perfect," Jack said, his voice calm despite the pressure of the situation, "but it'll hold up long enough to get you where you need to go." Henry stepped back, allowing Jack to work. The man's presence was oddly reassuring, even though Jack knew the actor had to be running out of time. He had an important meeting, and every second mattered. But Jack's hands moved methodically, working on the leak with a concentration that came from years of practice. His fingers trembled slightly, a result of the arthritis that had settled into his joints, but his mind was sharp, his hands steady despite the age and wear on his body. He wrapped the rubber piece around the leaking hose and sealed it as best as he could, using the water bottle to flush the system and help the makeshift repair take hold. He tightened a few bolts, checked the connections, and then stood back to survey his work. The whole process had taken about 20 minutes, but it felt like the blink of an eye. Jack had done this 1,000 times before, in places far less comfortable than the streets of San Francisco, and the memory of those days came back to him with each motion. "Give it a try now," Jack called out, stepping aside with a nod toward the engine. Henry slid into the driver's seat, his hands on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the dashboard. He turned the key, and for a moment the engine sputtered. Then, as if on cue, it roared to life, purring smoothly like a well-oiled machine. The sound of the engine was music to Jack's ears, and he felt a rush of pride as the car hummed beneath Henry's touch. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get him moving. Henry raised his eyebrows in surprise, clearly impressed. Impressive. he said, looking up from the dashboard. "I've seen people claim to know cars, but that's something else." Jack smiled faintly, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Just enough to get you where you need to go. No need to thank me. I've been there myself, trying to get by with whatever I had." Henry looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening with genuine gratitude. "You just saved me from missing an important meeting. How much do I owe you?" he asked, already reaching for his wallet. Jack shook his head, holding up a hand. "You don't owe me a thing. I'm just glad to help." There was a pause as Henry hesitated, clearly torn. Jack could see the battle playing out in his eyes. He wanted to offer something, to repay him for his time and effort. But Jack wasn't looking for money. Not from Henry. Not from anyone. "You sure?" Henry asked, his voice sincere. "I can't let you just do this without offering something." Jack smiled, his expression firm. "I've got what I need, believe me. This is enough," he gestured toward the car that now purred smoothly in front of them. "I did it because I could, that's all." Henry nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips as he placed his wallet back in his pocket. "Well, I guess I can't argue with that," he said, smiling for the first time since he'd broken down. "I hope I can return the favor someday." Jack didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say. He knew people didn't always get the chance to repay kindness, but that was okay. What mattered was that Henry could now make it to his meeting, that his day wouldn't be completely derailed by something as simple as a broken car. And that, to Jack, was enough. With a final nod, Henry slid back into the driver's seat, started the car, and eased onto the road. As the car hummed down the street, Jack stood for a moment, watching it disappear into the distance. The wind was still biting, the city still bustling around him, but in that brief interaction, Jack had found something he hadn't expected. A reminder that even in the most unexpected of places, even in the most difficult of lives, there was still room for kindness, for a moment of connection. Jack pushed his cart forward, feeling the weight of the cold wind on his skin, but somehow it didn't feel quite as harsh as before. He had done something today. He had made a difference, however small. And that, for him, was a victory. Jack shook his head, his voice steady, as he said, "No need, sir. I'm just glad I could help. My father always said, helping others is its own reward." Henry looked at him, his gaze lingering. There was something in his eyes, something thoughtful, maybe even a little searching, as he took in the sight of Jack's worn clothes and the cart that held everything he owned. The contrast between the two men was stark. Henry dressed in his expensive suit, polished shoes, and the look of a man accustomed to comfort and success, and Jack, with his weathered face, frayed coat, and the ragged remnants of a life that had long since slipped from his grasp. Yet, there was something about the way they stood there, two strangers connected by a broken-down car and a small act of kindness, that made the moment feel significant. "At least let me give you something for your trouble," Henry insisted, his tone firm as he pulled out his wallet. He didn't hesitate, as though he was used to offering compensation for the time and effort others had given him. Jack smiled, though it was a soft, weary thing. "Really? There's no need," he said, already beginning to turn back toward his usual spot, the familiar corner near the Tesla headquarters. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, his body feeling the familiar ache of another cold San Francisco morning. "I'm just happy to be useful again." The words carried more weight than Jack had expected. It wasn't just the work itself. It was the feeling of purpose that had long since eluded him, the sense that he was still capable, still able to contribute. For so long, Jack had felt invisible. People passed him by without a second glance, and he had stopped expecting anything different. But today, in the quiet of this unexpected moment, he had been seen, and that was enough. "Wait!" Henry called after him, his voice stopping Jack in his tracks. "What's your name?" Jack turned back slowly, pausing for a brief moment. There was something in Henry's voice that made him stop, something different than the usual polite exchange of names. Maybe it was curiosity? Maybe it was the genuine sincerity in the way Henry looked at him. Jack hesitated, then answered simply, "Jack Miller, sir." Henry paused, his eyes thoughtful. For a moment, the bustling sounds of the city seemed to fade into the background, and there was just the two of them, standing in the quiet, a bridge forming between their very different worlds. Henry took a deep breath, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then, in a tone that was both measured and introspective, he spoke. "I don't believe in coincidences," Henry said slowly. "Would you tell me your story?" The question hung in the air, and Jack felt something stir inside him. It wasn't a question he had expected. Most people, when they glanced at him, either ignored him or avoided making eye contact altogether. They didn't ask about his story. They didn't care. But Henry was different. There was a genuine curiosity there, a desire to understand. Jack could see it in the actor's eyes, in the way he waited patiently, giving him space to respond. Jack considered the question for a moment, his gaze drifting over to his cart, a collection of everything he owned. It had become a symbol of his life, the tangible evidence of his fall from a once full existence. He'd never really shared his story with anyone, not in any meaningful way, but something in Henry's expression made him want to try. "I don't know how much of a story it is," Jack began, his voice rough with age and experience. "I'm not a man of many words, never really been much of a storyteller, but I can tell you that I didn't start out like this." He gestured to himself, to the cart, to the tattered coat. "I had a family once, a wife, Linda. We were doing fine, had our house, a little savings, all the things people work for. But then, about 7 years ago, she got sick. Cancer. It wasn't something we saw coming, and by the time we knew what it was, we'd already spent everything we had trying to fight it. The medical bills piled up. We sold our house, our car, but in the end, we lost her anyway." Jack's voice faltered for a moment as the weight of that memory hit him. The pain, the helplessness of watching someone you love slip away despite all the effort and hope you put into saving them. It never really leaves. It lingered in the quiet of his words. "I couldn't keep up after that," Jack continued, his eyes distant now, lost in the past. "I tried to find work, but I was too old, too sick. I ended up here, on the streets. It's not something you plan for, but it's what happens when life knocks you down and you don't have the strength to get back up." There was a long pause as Jack finished speaking. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his story shared, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a simple truth, laid bare. He didn't know why he was telling Henry this. Maybe because the actor had asked, maybe because, for once, someone seemed to care. Henry stood there in silence, absorbing the words. There was no rush to reply, no attempt to fix or soothe the pain. Just a quiet understanding, as though he was listening not only with his ears, but with his heart. Finally he spoke, his voice low, almost reverent. I can't imagine what that must have been like," Henry said quietly, his eyes steady on Jack's face. "But you're here now. And you helped me. That says something about who you are." Jack looked at him, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't feel like much, most days." Henry took a slow breath and nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't know what I can do for you, Jack, But if there's ever a chance, if you ever need anything, I want you to know you can ask." Jack shook his head, but this time there was a softness in his expression, a small flicker of hope. "I appreciate that, sir. But right now, I've got everything I need. I just needed to be useful again." He gave a small shrug. "That's enough for me." For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of the world seeming to shift slightly. Jack felt a strange sense of peace settle in his chest, the kind that comes from knowing someone truly sees you, not just the face of homelessness, but the person beneath it. Henry smiled, a slow, genuine smile, and nodded once more. "Take care of yourself, Jack, and thank you, truly." With that, he turned and got into the car, the engine humming to life once more. Jack watched as Henry drove off, the sound of the tires fading into the distance. As the car disappeared from view, Jack turned back to his cart, his heart a little lighter than before. In this brief moment, he had found something he hadn't expected, a connection. And that, for Jack, was worth more than any dollar or promise ever could be. Over the next few minutes, Jack shared his story, serving in Vietnam, working for 30 years as a mechanic, the hard work that came with that, and the love and loss of his wife, Linda. He spoke plainly, without hesitation or embellishment, as though recounting the events of a distant past, but the weight of each word was unmistakable. He talked about the joy he'd felt working with his hands, the pride of being a soldier, and how those years had shaped the man he was today. But it was Linda's illness that weighed the heaviest in his recounting. He spoke of the long months spent in hospitals, the unrelenting battles with insurance companies, and the way the bills continued to pile up long after Linda had passed away. Despite the pain in his words, there was no bitterness, only the simple recounting of the facts, the reality of a life that had unraveled in ways he could never have foreseen. "Things happen," Jack concluded with a small shrug, his voice steady despite the weight of his history. "Can't change the past." Henry sat silently, absorbing Jack's words. His expression had softened as Jack spoke, the depth of his story clearly making an impression. For a moment, the only sound between them was the distant hum of the city, the soft rustle of wind, and the faint rumble of the broken-down car that had brought them together. Then, after a long pause, Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small business card. He handed it to Jack, his movements deliberate, and for the first time, Jack noticed the intensity in Henry's eyes. "Jack," Henry said, his voice low and steady, "I'm running late for my meeting, but I want you to go to this address tomorrow at 9 a.m. Ask for Emily in Human Resources, all right?" Jack looked down at the card, the simple text printed on it, and for a moment, he hesitated. His fingers traced the edge of the card, unsure of what to make of the offer. Was this some kind of joke? Or maybe Henry was just being polite, offering something that didn't mean anything. It wasn't the first time someone had said they'd help, only for those promises to fade into nothingness. "I don't want charity, sir," Jack said, the words coming out more bluntly than he intended. It was the truth, though. He didn't want to feel like a charity case. He'd fought for every inch of his survival, scraping by with what he had, and he wasn't about to accept a handout now. Henry's gaze never wavered. He locked eyes with Jack, his expression serious but warm. "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "It's an opportunity you've earned through your skills and your character. Will you come?" Jack looked at him, feeling the sincerity in Henry's voice. It wasn't charity. There was something different in Henry's tone, a genuine belief in the value of what Jack had to offer. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something shift inside him, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he had thought. Maybe there was still room for him in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. Jack glanced down at the business card in his hand, still unsure. He had lived most of his life relying on himself and his instincts, but there was something about Henry's offer that felt real. He wasn't asking for anything in return, just for Jack to show up. It felt like a chance, a door that might open to something he had long since stopped expecting. Jack took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I'll be there." Henry gave him a small nod in return, his expression softening with approval. "Good," he said. "I'll be thinking of you, Jack. I hope you take the chance." With that, Henry turned and walked back to his car, still moving with the kind of purpose that Jack remembered from his own younger days. Jack watched him go, feeling the strange mixture of uncertainty and possibility stir inside him. For a moment he stood there, holding the business card in his hand, still unsure of what tomorrow would bring. But something had shifted. Something had been set in motion. Jack didn't know if it would lead to anything, but he knew that this was the first time in a long while that he had felt truly seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. That night, Jack could hardly sleep in his usual spot, nervously touching the business card to make sure it was real. At dawn, he used his last coins at the public restroom to wash up and put on his least worn-out clothes. At exactly 9 a.m., Jack stood at the reception desk of Tesla's headquarters, feeling lost among the sleek surfaces and impeccably dressed employees. To his surprise, he was led straight into an office where a kind-faced woman introduced herself as Emily. "Mr. Miller, we've been expecting you." She smiled warmly. "Mr. Cavill told me about you yesterday. We have an offer for you." What happened next felt like a dream. They offered Jack the position of senior maintenance advisor for Tesla's classic car division. His decades of mechanical experience would be invaluable in helping them make electric vehicles more accessible for ordinary mechanics. "We'll provide temporary housing until you get settled," Emily explained, "and your medical benefits will start immediately." Jack's hands shook as he gripped the arm of the chair. "But I'm 73 years old. Most people think I'm too old to work." Emily smiled gently. "Mr. Cavill believes that wisdom and experience don't have an expiration date. He was impressed not just by your skills, but by your integrity. You helped him without expecting anything in return. That's exactly the kind of person we want on our team." Tears welled in Jack's eyes. "My Linda always said everything happens for a reason. I didn't believe it when I lost everything, but maybe she was right." That afternoon, Jack was taken to a small but clean apartment near the office. As he set his cart with all his belongings in the corner of his new home, he noticed an envelope on the table. Inside was a note from Henry Cavill. "Jack, your kindness and skills helped me yesterday when you could have easily turned your back on the world. Consider this a small repayment." Below, it was a check sufficient to cover all of Linda's remaining medical bills. Jack sank to his knees, overwhelmed. For the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to cry. Not out of sadness, but out of gratitude and hope. The next morning, Jack Miller walked into Tesla's headquarters, wearing a crisp new uniform, ready to start his first day of work. As he passed by the spot where he used to sit with his cardboard sign, he whispered a thank you to Linda. She always told him that kindness finds its way back to you, even in the darkest of times. And there, under the morning light of a new day, Jack Miller, once homeless, but never without dignity and compassion, began the next chapter of his life. In the weeks that followed, Jack's experience proved invaluable to Tesla. His hands-on knowledge helped the company make their vehicles more accessible to traditional mechanics, bridging the gap between old and new automotive technology. His humble approach and willingness to share his knowledge made him beloved among the engineering and maintenance teams. More importantly, Jack became known for his habit of carrying granola bars in his pocket to share with the homeless people he met on his way to work. "Everyone deserves kindness," he would say with a gentle smile. "Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. I know that firsthand." Jack's stories spread throughout the company, inspiring many. Before long, Tesla employees began volunteering at homeless shelters, and the company launched a program to train and hire veterans and struggling seniors. When asked about the remarkable change in his life, Jack simply shook his head humbly. "The real blessing isn't the job or the money," he said. "It's being reminded that I still have something to offer the world. Sometimes we all just need someone to believe in us, even for a moment, to help us believe in our hearts again." Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful morning when he fixed the broken-down car, Jack would return to that same spot near Tesla's headquarters. But this time, instead of seeking help, he spent the day helping others in need, proving that the circle of kindness never truly ends. It just changes forms. Jack's story became a testament to the power of compassion, the value of experience, and the truth that life is never too late to surprise you with its capacity for change. Jack Miller, the once homeless veteran who helped without asking for anything in return, became a living reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from those who have the least to give but the biggest hearts to share. Join us for more inspiring stories. Hit subscribe and never miss a moment of William's wisdom stories.